General Jimmy Doolittle's spectacular raid on Tokyo in April 1942 from the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Hornet gave Americans hope in the dark days following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Later he served as commander of the mighty 8th Air Force in Europe. Doolittle had succeeded General Ira Aker in that position. Many years later, Lieutenant Generals Aker and Doolittle were both promoted by President Reagan to the 4-star rank of general on the retired list. General Doolittle was an aircraft pioneer and helped to develop blind flying with only the aid of instruments. He also earned a doctoral degree at MIT.
After enlisting in the aviation section of the U.S. Army Signal Corps in 1917, Lieutenant James H. Jimmy Doolittle spent World War I as a flight instructor and never saw combat. Among the minuscule 4% of air service pilots retained after the war, he quickly earned a reputation as a reckless young daredevil. But for Doolittle, there was an underlying purpose to what often appeared to be nothing more than aerial hijinks. He was, in fact, very methodically satisfying an inborn curiosity concerning what both he and the airplane were capable of doing. Stunts were one means of defining those limits. A gambler? Perhaps, but one who, throughout his flying career, would always very carefully calculate the odds. These qualities, plus his extraordinary flying skills, kept him alive and made him well suited for his post-war career as a record-breaking test pilot. Breaking records satisfied a personal need to overcome challenges, and if along the way he could generate some publicity for air power's potential, then so much the better.
1922, I flew from Pablo Beach, Florida, near Jacksonville, to San Diego, California, a distance of about 2,200 miles in 22 hours and 20 minutes. In 1931, I flew from Los Angeles, California to New York in 11 hours and 15 minutes. That first flight was the first time that the continent had ever been crossed in less than one day. Second flight was the first time it had ever been crossed in less than half a day.
But it was as a speed king that Jimmy Doolittle would win his greatest fame during the 20s. In 1925, for example, he was in Baltimore, Maryland, to fly the elegant Curtiss R3 C1 Racer against some of the world's finest pilots in the prestigious Schneider Seaplane Trophy Race. Having carefully devised an innovative technique for approaching and turning the pylons by diving into his turns, he completely obliterated the world's seaplane speed record, outpacing his nearest rival by more than 33 miles per hour, while flying at an average speed of 232 miles per hour. The adulation that came with such victories was gratifying, to be sure, but for Doolittle, these races had a rational purpose beyond personal glory.
These record flights have a very real meaning. Competition has perhaps always been the greatest stimulus to improvement. And out of this competition came improvements that were improvements in the performance of aircraft and the safety of aircraft, and those improvements were immediately applicable to the military and indirectly applicable to commercial aviation.
Under the surface of his sometimes flamboyant public image, Doolittle was always really, at heart, a dedicated flight researcher, a man trying to bridge the intellectual gap between theory and practice, between the arcane calculations of the aeronautical engineer and the everyday realities of the pilot. Thus, for example, during an extraordinary series of extremely hazardous test flights in 1924, he methodically pushed an aircraft to the point where, at 7.8 Gs, structural failure actually occurred. These tests yielded the first genuinely scientific measurements of the full effects of acceleration on an aircraft and its pilot, as Doolittle, with himself as guinea pig, analyzed and reported on the little understood phenomena of pilot blackout. Flying a Curtiss Hawk in 1927, he once again pushed his own endurance to the limit, as he successfully performed the first outside loop in history, a maneuver which actually made him see red as the blood rushed to his head. Having earned one of the first American doctorates in aeronautical science at MIT in 1925, Doolittle continued to ply his trade as chief test pilot at Wright Field in the mid-20s, and in 1928 he was chosen to manage the Full Flight Laboratory, an endeavor which was financed by the Guggenheim Foundation and dedicated to studying the problems of flight in adverse weather conditions. After months of painstaking preparation, he made what he later considered one of the most important flights of his career in September of 1929.
I made the first blind flight, first completely blind flight, taking off under a hood, flying a prescribed course, and landing back under the hood without ever having seen out of the airplane. This doesn't sound very important now, but out of that came two instruments, the artificial horizon, the directional gyro, that are today standard equipment on every commercial airplane and every combat military airplane.
This flight was indeed a major milestone in aviation progress, marking the beginning of the end of the so-called seat-of-the-pants era of flying. Such progress hadn't been without risks. He had once been forced to bail out from a stricken craft just 500 feet above the ground, and it hadn't been without cost. Doctor of Science, national hero, by 1930, Jimmy Doolittle was still just a lowly lieutenant in the peacetime Air Corps. Reluctantly resigning his commission that year, he went to work for Shell Oil as the manager for its various aviation concerns. Leaving the Air Corps, however, did not mean leaving the cockpit. In 1931, a streamlined biplane, the Laird Super Solution, was designed specifically for him to fly in the first Bendix race. Taking off from Burbank, California, he sped cross-country to Albuquerque, where he stopped to refuel. Touching down again to refuel in Kansas City, he streaked onward to Cleveland, crossing the finish line a full hour ahead of his closest competitor. On this remarkable day, however, he wasn't done yet. Refueling his craft, within minutes he was off again, this time for Newark, New Jersey. It was on this memorable flight that he became the first man ever to span the continent in less than half a day. And after touching down at Newark, he turned right around and raced back to Cleveland, where, after 15 grueling hours in the cramped cockpit, he was happily reunited with his wife Jo and eldest son, Jim Jr. The following year, he had hoped to fly a much modified version of the Super Solution in the national air races at Cleveland. A crash landing dashed those hopes, until another craft, the radical GB-R1, was offered as a replacement. Capable of speeds in excess of 300 miles per hour, the barrel-shaped GB racers were, without doubt, the fastest aircraft in the skies. Unfortunately, they were also among the deadliest. Wickedly unstable and unforgiving, they would kill most of the pilots who flew them. Doolittle himself later looked back on the GB as the touchiest airplane he'd ever been in. Flying it, he said, was a bit like balancing a pencil on the tip of your finger. But fly it he did. Mastering the treacherous little craft during the qualifying runs, he sped to a new world speed mark of 296 miles per hour. And before more than 50,000 wildly cheering spectators, he went on at an average speed more than 10 miles per hour faster than his nearest competitor to win the grand finale of the air races, the Thompson Trophy Race. This victory was the high point of Jimmy Doolittle's racing career and his farewell to competitive flying. He had fulfilled all of his racing ambitions, and the sport of air racing had, in his view, fulfilled its legitimate purpose. Besides, as he explained to the press, he had yet to hear the first case of anyone engaged in the sport dying of old age. He may have removed himself from the national limelight, but during the remainder of the 30s, Jimmy Doolittle went on to make some of his most important contributions to the future of American air power. At the time, what was then called the Army Air Corps was struggling to maintain itself, and to establish the then novel idea that the critical importance of air power in future combat would make it essential that a separate organization, an independent Air Force, should be established. In 1934, Doolittle was appointed to the Baker Board, a presidentially mandated commission chartered to plot the future course of American military aviation. On a board which reported that the ideas of various air power zealots were all visionary, his was the single dissenting voice. A solitary voice, however, which would prove to be extraordinarily prophetic. Doolittle's willingness to go out on a limb for something he believed in was perhaps nowhere better illustrated than in his long and hard-fought campaign to convince Shell Oil that it should invest millions to develop a product for which no market existed in the 1930s, 100-octane fuel. The Air Corps was quite content with the 91-octane fuel it was then using, and Doolittle quite literally risked his reputation and his career on what was mockingly referred to as Doolittle's folly. But his ultimate success in this risky effort would help ensure American air superiority in the perilous times ahead. And after trips to Europe in the late 30s, he became convinced that those times were imminent. Volunteering to return to active duty, he rejoined the Air Corps in July of 1940. He was a 45-year-old lieutenant colonel when, on December 7th, 1941, the United States endured the most humiliating defeat in its history. Pearl Harbor and its immediate aftermath left the nation in shock and at low ebb. Under Doolittle's command, just 3 months later, a group of hand-selected volunteers were at Eglin Field in Florida, training for Special Project Number 1. None of them knew anything about the mission ahead. All they did know was that they were expected to get a fully loaded B-25 Mitchell medium bomber off the ground within less than 500 feet. By April 2nd, they found themselves on board the carrier Hornet, steaming westward. Only then were they informed of their mission. They were to proceed to a point about 400 miles east of Japan, take off from the carrier deck, and then make their way to targets in the Japanese home islands. If all went as planned, they would then proceed southward to landings in the vicinity of Quchao, China. En route to the launch point, the 16 5-member crews were briefed daily on the details of their missions. They tried to keep in shape, and they conducted mock ceremonies during which Japanese medals were wired to 500-pound bombs so they could be returned with interest. All of the careful planning, however, went awry in the early morning hours of April 18th. Still 650 miles away from Japan, the carrier task force was spotted by a pair of Japanese picket ships. The ships were destroyed, but the question remained, had they reported their sighting? Admiral Halsey, the task force commander, couldn't risk jeopardizing his carriers by proceeding further into Japanese waters, and, after conferring with Doolittle, issued the order to launch immediately. This meant that Doolittle and his B-25s would have to fly an extra 250 miles, and, even fully loaded with fuel, their chances of safely reaching China would be something less than slim. At 8:20 a.m., Doolittle's lead aircraft stood poised on the pitching deck. With just 467 feet of deck space ahead of him, he started his takeoff roll, and, with 100 feet to spare, became the first pilot ever to fly a medium-sized bomber off of a flight deck. His destination was Tokyo. With characteristic modesty and understatement, he later commented,
I've frequently been asked what was the purpose and what was the effect of the first Tokyo raid. Well, the purpose was to take the war to Japan, to show them that their island was not inviolate. The effect was to cause them to divert some of their military strength that was needed in the South Pacific to the protection of the home islands. The actual damaging effect was very little. We carried 1 ton of bombs in each one of 16 airplanes. We dropped 16 tons of bombs on 4 or 5 different targets. When you realize that from the Marianas in the later stages of the war, B-29s were carrying as much as 6,000 tons of bombs in one operation and dropping them on a single target, you realize how puny our effort was.
In wretched weather and low on fuel, none of the B-25s were able to make it to landing fields in China. And in the immediate aftermath of the raid, with his crews scattered and their aircraft lost, Doolittle was convinced that his mission had been an abysmal failure. He was wrong, of course. In China, he and most of his surviving raiders were honored by the Chinese government. And when they returned stateside, they were given a hero's welcome. Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle was rewarded with the Congressional Medal of Honor and promotion to the rank of Brigadier General. His first major assignment was as commander of the 12th Air Force, then preparing for Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. His job was, first, to prevent Axis supplies, material, and personnel from getting into Tunisia, and then to prevent enemy troops from getting out. His forces carried out their mission with devastating effect. As the campaign drew to a close in April of 1943, now Major General Doolittle placed it in perspective.
The Battle of Tunisia is over. It was a hard fight, but it represented only the initial phase of this operation. It was a preliminary bout. The main event will be the all-out air operation against Germany and against Berlin itself.
During the North African campaign, Doolittle had earned a nickname, the Flying General, because he'd made it a point to fly frequent combat missions with his units so that he could fully understand the pressures under which they operated. It was within this context, in July of 1943, that he participated in the first air attack on Rome, and thus became the only commander who'd be able to say that he had led initial combat missions over 2 of the 3 Axis capitals. He'd never get the chance to fly over Berlin, but he'd be in command of the Air Force that would. In January of 1944, now Lieutenant General Doolittle was placed in command of the mighty 8th Air Force, a massive aerial juggernaut that was then taking the war to the heartland of Hitler's Germany. The 8th's bomber losses had been prodigious at times. The practice had been for the bombers to get in over their targets, release their bombs, and then get the hell out as fast as they could. Cripples and stragglers had been left behind for Luftwaffe fighters to finish off. Shortly after assuming command, General Doolittle issued a controversial order directing that the speed of all formations should be reduced so that the slowest craft could keep up. Bomber crews were to maintain extremely tight formations at those speeds so that the massed firepower of the entire formation could be used to protect the cripples. Though not exactly popular with the bomber crews at first, this innovation ultimately saved a good many of their lives. This decision may have been unpopular among bomber crews, but they were absolutely outraged by a subsequent Doolittle directive. In the spring of 1944, it was absolutely imperative that the Allies achieve air superiority over Western Europe in preparation for the upcoming Normandy invasion. Up until that time, the mission of the 8th fighters had been a defensive one, to provide escort for the heavy bombers. In yet another calculated risk, Doolittle told his fighter commanders, "From now on, that no longer holds. Your mission is to destroy the German Air Force." This momentous decision took extraordinary moral courage. For in turning the fighters loose, Doolittle was not only risking his own career, he was also risking the lives of thousands of young men. And among the bomber crews, he had to endure the epithet of killer. Undaunted, Doolittle believed that by unleashing his fighters against the Luftwaffe wherever they found it, in the air or on the ground, the bombers would ultimately benefit. And throughout the early months of 1944, the 8th Fighter Groups went on a rampage in the skies over Western Europe, unleashing their fury against the Luftwaffe, blowing it out of the skies, and decimating it on the ground. Doolittle's calculated gamble, what he later regarded as his most important military decision, paid off handsomely. When June 6th, D-Day, finally arrived, he flew over the beaches of Normandy. During an hour's flight, he didn't spot a single German aircraft. Air superiority had been won, and in the months that followed, Doolittle's 8th Air Force helped pound the Axis into final submission. General Doolittle retired from active duty in 1946, but in point of fact, he never became inactive, and he never lost his sense of duty. Back in April of 1943, he had the opportunity to get together with some of his compatriots from the Tokyo raid in a small farmhouse in North Africa. The commitment these men felt toward one another was real, and in April of 1945, the Doolittle Raiders got together for their first official reunion in Miami Beach. That gathering has been followed by reunions in virtually every year since, as the Raiders come together for a few days of camaraderie, reminiscence, and, as always, to drink a toast to their achievement and their missing comrades. A man not inclined to rest on his laurels, Jimmy Doolittle's so-called retirement years were filled with activity and achievement. He was, for millions of Americans, Mr. Aviation, and no one else in post-war America could speak so convincingly in air power's behalf. Shortly after the war, he was instrumental in the formation of the Air Research and Development Command, forerunner of today's Air Force Systems Command. And though a civilian, he continued to serve as a troubleshooter for the newly established Air Force, as at long last it became a reality. He would ultimately serve as the chairman of the Air Force's Scientific Advisory Board during a critical period when the Air Force was taking its first tentative steps toward the new frontier of space. He also served as the last chairman of the venerable National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, as, then in the process of transforming itself into NASA, it too looked toward exploration beyond the atmosphere. Approaching age 65, the one-time daredevil test pilot ended his flying career in 1961. He was finally out of the cockpit, but not out of the world of aviation. He was, for example, a frequent, keenly interested visitor to Edwards Air Force Base, where aviation continued to meet its future, and where he could renew his relationships with test pilots, a breed of men with whom he shared a deep and abiding kinship. General Hap Arnold once observed that Jimmy seems never to have been absent when something big was happening in air power. Indeed, his life has spanned the history of aviation. A remarkable life which has been intertwined with so many of the remarkable events of that history. A remarkable life, a remarkable man, General James H. Jimmy Doolittle.
General Joseph Vinegar Joe Stilwell is probably best known for the great supply route that he fought for and carved out of the jungles and mountains from India through North Burma to China. He was a good soldier and commander of the American China-Burma-India Theater, better known as the CBI, but he was not a diplomat. General Stilwell was ordered home in October 1944 after he had a political argument with Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. Ironically, at its dedication in January 1945, Chiang Kai-shek changed the name of what had been called the Doolittle Road to the Stilwell Road.
Stilwell said the last word on the campaign.
I claim we got a hell of a beating. We got run out of Burma, and it's humiliating as hell. I think we ought to find out what caused it, go back and retake the place.
Joseph W. Stilwell was born in March of 1883, the place, Palatka, Florida. His childhood and early youth, however, were to be spent in Yonkers, New York. Even in earliest years, he bore the stamp in appearance and in character of much we consider typically American. There was a love for sports, and in these he excelled. There were also mischievous high spirits, perhaps too high. Discipline was indicated. And so the family decision to send Joseph Stilwell to the military academy at West Point. The year was 1900, and the decision a fortunate one. Few men could know, as we know through hindsight, that young men with qualities of courage and leadership would be needed to serve the nation through ensuing years of crisis. Between the lines of a yellowed class yearbook, we can read hints of those qualities. For the young quarterback, they were already winning a permanent niche among West Point's football immortals. They were destined to serve him on fields broader than the gridiron. Graduation from the academy did not end Joseph Stilwell's association with West Point. The newly commissioned second lieutenant of infantry was to spend 11 of the next 14 years teaching a succession of classes. His field of instruction, foreign languages. The natural aptitude in these subjects was to prove as fortunate for the nation as was the decision to make the military his profession. In the crowded years not spent at the academy, there would be assignment to service schools and tours of duty in the Philippines and at home. Meanwhile, history was setting the stage for the first of our century's major crises, worldwide conflagration. In its flames, untried American leadership would be tested and tempered. Joseph Stilwell would be among those to receive their baptism of fire. Over there was the patriotic song of the hour. Over there sailed young American manhood to fight in the first international conflict of our history. With the temporary rank of major, Joseph Stilwell disembarked in France during the bleak, disheartening December of 1917. There followed a brief period of service with a British division. Then, with his fluency in French, he became liaison officer with the French 17th Corps. For the young major, there was now action at Verdun, Le Fère, Toul, Saint-Mihiel. For service in this last engagement, Stilwell, now Assistant Chief of Staff, 4th Army Corps, received the Distinguished Service Medal. For military attainments of a high order, read the citation. With the war's end, it was now Colonel Stilwell who went on to serve with the Army of Occupation within Germany. There he remained until July of 1919. By now, the enthusiastic scenes welcoming American troops back to civilian life were past history. Nor for the returned professional soldier would there be any termination of service. In full recognition of his talent for language, Joseph Stilwell's next assignment of duty was to take him to Pekin, there to study and attain fluency in the many Chinese dialects. With him went his wife and their 3 children. 2 more would be born during the years in China. The comfortable Stilwell home came to reflect his growing appreciation of Oriental art. It was to earn him recognition as a connoisseur. To the Chinese people around him, the perceptive Stilwell brought his own humane understanding. Out of it came mutual respect and warm regard. One day in the future, these would help forge military victory. But before that day, there were to be years of service for Joseph Stilwell. Now he must return to the United States. Beside him at Fort Benning's Infantry Training School, fellow future general officers taught and studied. George C. Marshall, Omar Bradley, names that were to become household words in a nation at war. At Fort Leavenworth's Command and General Staff School, there were additional years of study. Then, once again, it was back to China, this time as military attaché to the United States Embassy in Pekin. Here he remained as the clash of conflicting interests between Japan and the awakening giant China led inevitably to incident, and incident to all-out war. The incident was Manchuria. The military machine of the Mikado required no organizing, for the military clique which then held power had long anticipated this day. The overall plan was to decimate China, reduce her province by province. Japan's modern Air Force would meanwhile be destroying China's sources of power to resist. Chinese courage proved no defense against the perfected military efficiency of the enemy. On hand as American observer was Colonel Joseph Stilwell. It became his growing and unshakable conviction that the Chinese soldier was a first-class fighting man. He needed only first-class equipment, first-class leadership. Chiang Kai-shek, the one leader able to preserve Chinese unity, was by now forced to withdraw to the interior city of Chongqing. From here, he sought endlessly to enlist the aid of other nations. There had already occurred the Panay incident, in which an American ship in Chinese waters had been sunk by Japanese bombers. This had crystallized the American sentiment that had long inclined to sympathy for China. Aid had come as young Americans volunteered their services. Acting unofficially as private citizens, one such group, the Flying Tigers, were winning fame as they took impressive toll of Japanese planes. For China's armies engaged in their unequal struggle, arms and equipment were now made available. To cut off these sources of material aid, Japan systematically occupied or blockaded one after another of China's port cities. In effect, she built a wall around China. Deprived of needed supply from without, a weakened China would be vulnerable to the heavy blows of the invading forces. Once shattered, she could be conquered piecemeal. The former American observer was now back home again, serving at California's Presidio. A major general, he commanded the 3rd Army Corps. Step by step, history was setting the stage for its climactic tragedy. Out of that tragedy, Joseph Stilwell would emerge to play a heroic role. From a country stunned by disaster, General Stilwell was sent to China, there to serve as Chief of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek's Allied staff, and with a small American staff to take nominal command of China's 5th and 6th Armies. The new responsibility brought him his 3rd star. In the absence of clear-cut Allied command lines, General Stilwell's first job was to help in the defense of Burma. Burma offered the only route by which material aid could be fed into China. China must be built up, made stronger and stronger, until her allies could join her in going over to the offensive. That would be a far-off day, for her allies were preoccupied with other theaters of war. The Burma which was to know Stilwell's exploits had ceased to be a modern Eden of song and romantic fiction. It had become a battlefield. General Stilwell and his Chinese, together with outnumbered British, Free French, and Dutch troops, fought on, but the effort was doomed. The Japanese steamroller pushed on. It had administered humiliating defeats to the Allies in the Pacific and elsewhere in Southeast Asia. It had taken over thousands of square miles, together with peoples and resources. Now it rolled across Burma. India's borders lay open to attack. Worst of all, that last vital land route, the Burma Road, lay useless. Once again, the old lesson must be learned. Courage alone is not enough. For the Allies, withdrawal became retreat. Retreat, a nightmare route. In the ordeal, Joseph Stilwell's full stature revealed itself. Refusing the comforts his age and rank might have claimed, he personally conducted one group of 400 battered troops, Burmese nurses and civilians, to the safety of India. There at New Delhi, he was to utter the now classic admission of defeat and announce his determination to go back and wipe it out. Here was the honesty, the directness, the tough moral fiber that characterized the man. The battered campaign hat and shirt sleeves now became a familiar sight as the job of regrouping and training began. Supply for besieged China, cut off from her allies, must now depend on a limited number of transport planes, the few that Allied command could make available. Forced into a round-the-clock system, these were also bringing out of China the manpower that would be needed for that return to Burma. In one such operation, 14,000 troops were carried without loss or mishap. Limited too in number were the planes needed for the thousands of Chinese flyers in training, and even for those units which must continue aerial warfare against the enemy within China. American Flying Tigers were now a part of regular fighting forces, and these still flew for their old leader, General Chennault. And now another of Joseph Stilwell's goals must be pressed. Nothing less than a new road to bypass the severed link of the old Burma Road. Modern machinery and trained manpower could clear at the Indian end of the projected loop. At the China end, it was a far different story. Here it must be back-breaking manual labor with primitive tools. Men, women, and even children threw themselves into the Herculean task. China knew what was at stake, and China responded. Then from Quebec, Canada, came heartening news. Allied leadership in conference authorized greater aid and a newly organized Southeast Asia Command. Supreme Commander was to be Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten, his deputy, Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell. The increase in material aid was making greater demands upon air transport. Suddenly, the hitherto ignored operation captured the imagination of the outside world. Flying over the hump became a familiar phrase. Behind the phrase lay the reality of every type of plane available, many lacking modern instruments, flying back and forth in unpredictable weather, their route over uncharted and treacherous mountains. The stockpile for this, the stepchild of the war effort, was mounting. The tools of battle were now ready and waiting to help settle an old score. The sideshow war had been remembered. Air power opened the prelude to attack. And to sustain it, fighters and bombers of the newest types arrived in increasing numbers. Soon the prelude to attack was no longer a curtain raiser, but the first stage of fiery assault. The day had come. Men from China, from all parts of the British Commonwealth, from India and Burma, and from far off Africa. Men of many races, many tongues were on the march, and with General Stilwell's polyglot army, a growing number of American units. Among them were General Merrill's troops, experienced fighters from the Pacific Theater. Merrill's Marauders was to be their popular name as they helped make history. In the 2 years of preparation, General Stilwell had molded a machine to beat the enemy at his own game, mountain and jungle warfare. Man-made weapons would exact casualties, but losses even heavier were inflicted by malaria, dysentery, hepatitis, and a wide range of tropical diseases. For the men who fought, enemy metal could hit as hard, sickness could be as crippling as in any other theater. For them, Burma was no sideshow. Supply for the men in their isolated pockets of warfare often had to come by airdrop. In twisting mile-deep canyons and jungle-covered terrain, a miss by a few yards could be as bad as missing by a few hundred miles. Seemingly everywhere was lean, raw-boned Uncle Joe, as he was referred to generally. Bluntness had also earned him the title Vinegar Joe. Doubtless there were saltier names coined in the ranks. Doubtless, too, Joseph Stilwell chuckled over them in private. The overworked term soldier's soldier has lost much luster. But Joseph Stilwell, sharing the hardships and dangers of his men, gave the phrase real meaning. His was the unique capacity for commanding respect and obedience while evoking a genuine affection. Perhaps no group regarded the general and the man with warmer feelings than did the Chinese troops in his command. It was no secret that General Se, as he was called, had consistently extolled their courage and promoted their welfare, often in the face of adverse opinion from above. Repaying that faith now were unbroken Chinese victories in the field. southern Burma, names like the Salween and Irrawaddy rivers were back in the news. But now these were scenes of successes. It was the enemy who yielded as British-led Allied forces reclaimed more and more of Burma's soil. North and south, it was the same story. An old humiliation was being erased. It was now 2 years since the retreat from Burma, and the 61-year-old general could see his timetable for victory working out on schedule. In the circumstances, a birthday celebration was a pleasant and well-earned respite. The presence of a son, Colonel Joseph Stilwell, Jr., marked it a family occasion as well. But however welcome, such respites must be few and far between. The forgotten war in both South and North had reached its climax. The enemy knew well that each mile of ground lost in northern Burma meant another mile added to the link between India and China. The Lido Road was growing. On the heels of combat troops, often under enemy harassment, came the men who must hack out that road. The land itself fought back. Jungle growth would completely reclaim and obliterate in 2 weeks' time the work that neither the enemy nor disease nor climate could halt. Against the enemy, there was the rifle always close by. To fight the soil, every weapon from the axe to explosive charge was employed. The work went on. General Joseph Stilwell was almost literally dragging his road behind him. Yet, as he pushed on and the enemy grudgingly yielded, the mule trail became a road. In relative safety, engineering could expand the road into a solid truck route. As it neared completion, the derisive phrase, "impossible road," was heard less often. Across jungle-covered plateaus it stretched, across rivers untamed since the creation, yet now they had been harnessed and bridged. Across mountain ranges it traveled to narrow the gap between India and China. Then inevitably came the great day, the day when a first convoy could move along its 1,044-mile length. The enemy had been pushed out of northeast Burma and the way lay clear. Considering the difficulties and the hardships that had been borne in shaping its tortuous route, there seemed merit in the words of an American colonel who at the outset had said, "You don't have to be crazy to do this job, but it helps." Yet the Lido Road was now a reality. The first convoy rolled into Kunming, a token of the supply flow to follow. Honoring the man who had weathered all opposition to build the route, it was renamed the Stilwell Road. 4 months later, Allied command could announce victory in Burma. What of the man who had built the road and forged that victory? The tides and cross-currents of events had taken him far from what would have been his hour of triumph. Receiving his 4th star, General Stilwell came home to serve as commander of ground forces. Then off to the Pacific for a tour of battle fronts and installations. In the course of those next months, he became commander of the 10th Army. Later, he was to serve as commanding general at Okinawa. But wherever the assignment, the Stilwell story remained unchanged. He was still blunt, unassuming Uncle Joe, the general with no patience for pomposity and pretense. He was still the gaunt, typical American who somehow reminded of the symbolic figure Uncle Sam. More important, he was still the Joseph Stilwell with an understanding of the men in the ranks and a talent for winning their affection. It was, of course, his own feelings being reflected, as warm feelings always are. summer of 1945 was ending, and so too history's most devastating war. Like another great military leader who had vowed to return to the scenes of earlier defeat and erase its humiliation, General Stilwell would welcome the date September the 2nd. Aboard the battleship Missouri, on that day, General of the Army Douglas MacArthur submitted the formal surrender terms to a defeated enemy. An end had come to the agonies of a tortured world. Peace had come, in victory and with honor. Once again, for General Stilwell, there was assignment to the Presidio, but now as a prelude to well-earned retirement. At nearby Carmel was his family and the home he loved. Here he had planned to pass the rich remaining years that lay ahead. But now, a new enemy struck. This was the enemy within, one who would not be defeated. On October 12, 1946, after a short illness, stout-hearted Joseph Stilwell died. By his own instructions, ceremony was omitted. His ashes strewn out on the Pacific, whose waters play against the shores at beautiful Carmel. Today at West Point, the General's old campaign hat and combat boots are treasured mementos. There hangs, too, a portrait to recall Joseph W. Stilwell's career of service to his country. To the men he led, an example and an inspiration to greatness.